The Zoom has started, the recording has started, and I thank everyone for coming. I thank everyone who's joining us in wherever they're joining remotely. It's definitely a special day, and it's time to think of what my mom was to us, my mother was to me, to the whole family. It's safe to say that music suffused our lives in our house. It was just a normal fixture that the piano was the place that people would gather, that we would have music of all sorts, predominantly folk, classical, all kinds. My mom, as many of you know, played, besides piano that she had gotten from her mother, who was a piano teacher, she also played flute for many years, played in groups in a community orchestra in Brooklyn. She took up cello later on in her life, in her 60s, and then played with that. In another group in Jerusalem, she managed to find these opportunities to join together with people for both the social, many friends, and for the music. She said actually of her group in Jerusalem that whatever they lack in quality, they more than make up for in volume. And this is the way she took it. She took it as an inseparable element of her life. There are people who have a real problem with musical theater. I am not one of those people. She certainly wasn't one of those people, but people find the whole idea that someone could spontaneously burst into song as unnatural, as an artifice, that where did that come from? And that is basically a little bit of what our life was like. That was a little bit of the house. Besides musical theater, you want to go down to deep roots. So Gilbert and Sullivan, definitely yes, a steady fixture, just bursting out about, cleaning up the handle on the big front door. And she took this all the way forward from the roots straight through to Looney Tunes and Animaniacs, and every little aspect of the wacky and heartfelt expression that music brings. And musical theater can be, and all the other cartoon antics, they can be sly and silly, and they're also heartwarming and sublime. And it requires a lot of dedication. She had that. I spoke this morning a little bit about how I don't really remember her procrastinating. And, anyone who's ever learned a musical instrument, or who's tried to encourage their kids to learn a musical instrument, and heaven help you then, you know that practicing is work and dedication, patience, and she had that in spades. She was just loaded with that, and she didn't even really see it as work. She just saw it as what you do. It's part of your life, and it's what you do. And in a certain sense, I think of that almost like the word avoda, not avoda, like going to work, but avodat Hashem is just part of your way, something that you invest in for your life and for your spirit. So all I can say is that she truly enriched our lives with the spirit of song, and I think that will lead us into, hopefully, some of what we'll hear over the course of the evening. So I am delighted to host our speaker, Rabbi Uri Cohen. Rabbi Uri Cohen, he holds master's degrees in medieval Jewish history and Jewish education from Yeshiva University, and received rabbinic ordination from YU and from Yeshivat HaMiftar. He and his wife did shlichut for 4 years, serving as community educators for Torah Mitzion in Syracuse and the Jewish Learning Institute on campus at Princeton University, back when it was. Putting aside that time, they have lived right here in Ramat Beit Shemesh since 1999. We're really thrilled to have them not only as speaker, but also as, relatively speaking, our neighbors, friends. Currently, Rabbi Cohen teaches in person at Midreshet Moriah and online at Web Yeshiva. I highly recommend going to Web Yeshiva and checking out some of the Shirim courses that he's given there. Truly inspiring and eclectic. And he also writes articles for the Quran Tanakh of the land of Israel. I could not think of anyone more appropriate to speak on this subject and in this vein. So I'm pleased to welcome Rabbi Uri Cohen.
Yes, it's in the park.
This.
Fancy. Thanks. Wait, take this. Okay. Thanks to everybody for coming. The shir is Le'ilui Nishmat Avigayil Freyda bat Mordechai. I want to thank the Sevrinskys for giving me the opportunity to speak on this topic, which it turns out is a very appropriate topic, since it will include the topic of music. This is an unusual topic in the sense that it starts, or the question, which we'll get to shortly, is based on a pasuk, is based on something that's in the Torah itself, and yet, as far as I could tell, nobody really started discussing what that means until the last couple of generations. The first one I found who discusses it at all is in source number 4, the Netziv, in the late 1800s. Maybe there are people earlier, but not in an obvious way. Anyway, the premise is that in the Chumash, in the Torah itself, it refers to the Torah as a Shirah. We'll define Shirah shortly, but where do you see that? That's in source number 1. If anybody's watching the Zoom or is watching the recording, hopefully you'll have the source sheet in PDF. We're not going to discuss the psukim per se, but just to point out that when God says to Moshe, "Kitvu lachem et hashirah hazot," write this song, you can make a case that it's not referring to the entire Torah. It's referring to Ha'azinu, or possibly some other part of the Torah that was just said or was about to be said. But at least for halachic purposes, it does mean the entire Torah, as we see in source number 2, that the Rambam says the mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah is based on this phrase, Kitvu lachem et hashirah. Not just that God told Moshe, but God is telling us, each of us, we need to write a Sefer Torah. And how do you know that we should write a Sefer Torah? Because it says, write this song, or whatever Shirah is. So the question is, first of all, what is a Shirah? And then what does it mean that the Torah is called a Shirah? That's the question we are going to be addressing. There isn't, well, we're going to see, there are 2 main answers to this question, but even once you, what does it mean? What is a Shirah? We're going to see shortly a poem and a song. The next question, which has all sorts of possible answers, we're going to look at a few of which are, what does it mean to compare the Torah to that? So source number 3, Professor Ron Kleinman points out that in Tanakh Hebrew, in the Hebrew of the time of the Bible, Shirah and Shir are used interchangeably. It's in modern Hebrew that we make a distinction, and we say Shir is a song and Shirah is a poem. And it's interesting to discuss whether it's better to use the same word for both or to use different words. Just want to point out that at least at least the way that the Torah is presented originally, or at least the way that people understood the Torah, that distinction, the distinction that we make between poems and songs was, so it's anachronistic in that sense. Having said that, it did eventually, the word did eventually split, or we have these distinctions. You could argue that even today, it's not an obvious distinction between a poem and a song, other than one has music and one does not necessarily have music, because if a song has lyrics, then presumably the lyrics are a poem. We're not talking about clear, two completely discrete concepts. But having said that, to say that the Torah is a Shirah, that's the traditional understanding of a pasuk in the Torah. What does that mean? This has only been addressed recently, and we're going to look at the two different possibilities. One is that the Torah is a poem, in which case, how is the Torah like a poem? And the other, the Torah is a song, or like a song, in which case, how is the Torah like a song? That's what we're going to be addressing, and I hope to have some time at the end to open the floor to questions and comments, because it might very well be that there's an even better answer to this question that somebody in the room already has. Either you've thought of already, or you're going to come up with it as we're talking. That has not been written down, but that's okay. As we're going to see, most of the sources are contemporary. Maybe your answer is more interesting or more original or whatever. We're not talking about trying to figure out what the original answer is. We're talking about how it's meaningful for us. What can it mean that the Torah is a poem? So there's only one traditional rabbinic commentator, traditional 1800s, who addresses this. This is the Netziv in source number 4. The Netziv was the Rosh Yeshiva of the famous Volozhin Yeshiva. He was an unusual character for a Rosh Yeshiva because he wrote commentaries on Torah books that most Rosh Yeshiva probably aren't learning, and certainly are not writing commentaries on. The Netziv wrote a commentary on the She'iltot of Rav Achai Gaon, one of the books written by the Gaonim. Lots of religious Jews never even heard of this book. He wrote one of the more important commentaries on this book. The Netziv wrote a commentary on the Mechilta, on the halachic midrash on Sefer Shmot, which many of us have heard of, but most of us have not actually opened. It's not the sort of thing that most people learn on a regular basis. The Netziv wrote a commentary on that. And the Netziv wrote a commentary on the Chumash, which is very radical, coming from his social circles. Certainly the assumption of what we would now call Haredi, for lack of a better term, Rosh Yeshiva, where they learn Gemara all day, and he writes a commentary on the Chumash. And the commentary on the Chumash is not explaining Midrashim, which there are other classic rabbinic or Rosh Yeshiva write commentaries like that. No, he was trying to figure out Pshat. That's unusual. You don't have to agree with it, but it sets him apart from other people who were and are heads of classic yeshivot. And he has in the introduction to his book, the book is called Ha'amek Davar, looking deep into the thing. The name of his introduction is Kidmat Ha'emek, or Kidmat Ha'amek, I guess, the beginning of going deep into things. And I'm just going to quote parts of it. It's very long. We have a few paragraphs on the source sheet. I'm just going to translate bits and pieces of it. He asks, how is it that, in what way is the Torah a Shirah? And he understands Shirah as in modern Hebrew to mean a poem. So he says, he suggests that the Torah has two things in common with poetry, what he calls the nature of poetry, the teva, and the sgulat hashirah. How do you define sgula? For this purpose, I think he uses the word skula in the sense of a special quality. There's a special quality of language, or the richness of language in poetry, which we find in the Torah as well. And he elaborates that when you read a poem, you don't expect that everything is very clear, as you hope that it is when it comes to prose. a poem may describe something in metaphorical terms, in using imaginative terms, all sorts of ways that are not necessarily straight. What are you saying? And the Torah does this also. He says, the same way that like if you're analyzing a poem or you're trying to understand a poem, you write little notes to yourself on the side. This refers to that. Or I think the poet has this in mind. He says, when it comes to the Torah as well, it's often not obvious what the Torah means. You need to figure it out. And he says, this is on the top left of the source sheet, starting with the word kach. Kachu teva kol Torah. The nature of the whole Torah is she'en hasipur sheba mevuar yafet. The stories in the Torah are not well explained. There are lots of details that are not spelled out in the stories of the Torah, and we have to figure it out. The sense that you need to figure it out is something that the Torah has in common with poetry. And he says, I'm not even talking about drush, like a rabbi giving a sermon and coming up with some creative explanation. He says, no, just basic pshat. Sometimes you have to figure it out. But when you do figure it out, then you appreciate it much more than if it were very straightforward, like prose. That's one thing the Netziv thinks the Torah, in that sense, the Torah is like poetry. And second, he says the segula, the quality of the language of poetry is that there are all sorts of things you could do with language in a poem that you wouldn't do in prose. He says, just for example, the poet uses the first letter of each line to spell out the alphabet, which we know there are a bunch of places in Tanakh that do that. Ashrei most famously, but a bunch of places in Tehillim, in Eicha, elsewhere. And then Netziv says, we understand that for the poet, for the author of this acrostic, starting from Aleph and going through Taf, in order to get that effect, the poet, I'm already using words of poetry, the author of that acrostic needs to use a different word from the obvious word in order to make it fit. Okay, so he says a lot of the time with poetry, the author uses a word or a combination of words, which is not the obvious way, but it's on purpose, which is not necessarily what you would have with prose. This is what he calls the segula of poetry. And then he goes on to say, this is not just the Chumash, this is the Tanakh in general. The fact that there are all sorts of different interpretations of a given word in Tanakh, that's our assumption. There's more than one interpretation within traditional understandings of the Torah. That in and of itself is a way that is an aspect in which Tanakh has in common with poetry, according to the Netziv. And I found this interesting quote from the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He said, poetry is the best words in their best order, which is an interesting way to formulate that. There are a lot of different types of poems, but what they all or almost all have in common is the choice of words is deliberate. And there's a collection of poetry that I read last year. It's collected by Walter Delamere, who he was himself known as a poet, late 1800s or early 1900s. The book is called Come Hither, a collection of rhymes and poems for the young of all ages. I don't especially recommend this collection, but I really liked his introduction, in which he talks about getting interested in poetry at a young age. And one of the things that he says there is that what opened up poetry for him, reading poetry, was the understanding that a person who has written a poem has written it like that on purpose. And he goes on to say, this is not on the source sheet, with this thought in my head, I tried one day to alter the words of one or two of the simple and easy poems, or to put the words in a different order. And I found by so doing that you not only altered the sound of the poem, but that even the slightest alteration in the sound a little changed the sense. Either you lost something of the tune and runningness, or the words did not clash right, or you blurred the picture the words gave you, or some half-hidden meaning vanished away. I don't mean that every poem is perfect, but only that when I changed them, it was almost always very much for the worse. And then he gives an example. Pick a nursery rhyme. Old King Cole was a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he. He called for his pipe, and he called for his bowl, and he called for his fiddlers 3. Now suppose, Delamere writes, suppose instead of these 4 lines of the rhyme you put, Old King Cole was a jolly old man, the jolliest old man alive. He called for his cup, and he called for a pipe, and he called for his fiddlers 5. By so doing, Delamere explains, by so doing, you have actually added 2 extra fiddlers, and yet somehow you have taken away some of the old 3's music. Or you could write it this way. This is the prose version. Cole I was now a monarch advanced in age and of a convivial temperament. On any festive occasion, he would bid his retainers bring him his goblet and smoking materials, and would command his musicians to entertain him on their violins, which they did. And Delamere concludes, all the facts are there, and many more words, but scarcely a trace of my old King Cole, and not a single tweedle-eedle of the fiddling. Would anyone trouble to learn that by heart? So I thought that was a good way to bring out the point that I think this is similar enough to what the Netziv is saying. The poem is written that way on purpose. The use of the words is there for a reason, and your job as the reader of the poem is to figure out the significance, and in that sense, that's the way that we read or should read the Torah as well. If you say that the Torah is a poem or is like a poem, then presumably, if you do what Delamere did to Old King Cole, if you view it as prose, then you're going to be making a mistake. If somebody's not familiar with poetry and you show them a poem, they're probably going to be very aggravated or confused, because why isn't this saying things in a normal way? Because it's not prose. But we start with the assumption that a poem doesn't have to be prose. If you view the poem as prose, and then you have to figure out what it means like prose, then there's a problem. I want to illustrate this with one more poem, and then we'll move on. This is from the contemporary poet Billy Collins, who probably one of the better known American living poets. He was the poet laureate a few years back. He has a short poem called Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. That's Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. And it's not exactly the same thing, but it seems to me that that sort of mistake that he's describing, let's try to figure out what it means, and then we'll have understood the poem like prose, because I want to figure out what the words mean. It seems to me this is reminiscent of what Rav Kook writes in source number 6 in one of his later published, much later published works, Shmona Kvatzim, in which he talks about heresy, Shirah, somebody who rejects the Torah. And he uses very strong formulation. He says, Hakfira be'atzma hi hasrisut hagmura mikol shira. Rejecting the Torah is like a type of sterilization of a poem. In other words, you are removing all the beautiful aspects of the poem. You are tying it to a chair and beating it with a hose to find out what it means. You're viewing it as if it's the facts. Either the facts are true or they're not true. Is the Torah scientifically proved? Is it historically proved? and if not, then I'm going to reject it. That seems to be the assumption about kfira. V'i ha'efsharut listagel v'ha'emet hagdola mikol cheker prozai. He says heresy is the inability to get used to the truth, which is bigger than a scholarly approach to prose. Meaning, if the Torah were prose, then okay, so what does it mean? How does it fit? How does it fit with the facts that I'm starting with? But the Torah isn't prose, it's a poem. And if you relate to a poem in the way that you relate to prose, you're going to end up in a very problematic place. From Bill Collins' perspective, it's the students missing the point of the poem completely. And in Rav Kook's, I guess, mashal here, it's somebody ends up rejecting the Torah because it doesn't fit into what they expect it to be. The inability to recognize that there can be, the Torah is bigger, the Torah is true in a way that's bigger than prose. The tikkun ha'olam, and the way that you fix the world, Rav Kook continues, talui depends on b'shivat hashir v'hitchadsho, in the return of the poem and renewing it. That's so Rav Kook. Okay, so this is all we're going to say about poetry. And if anybody's anything more to say about poetry, hold it till the end. Maybe the Torah is like poetry in a different way, but I just thought this was an interesting approach. The rest of what we're going to say now is the other approach, namely, what if the Torah is not so much Shirah, but shir, not so much a poem, but a song. And we'll see a few different approaches right now. It's interesting that there are classic metaphors for God creating the world, God creating the universe. The most classic one is in source number 8, Mishnah Pirkei Avot, Ba'asara ma'amarot nivra ha'olam. God created the world with 10 statements. It wasn't just, and God said, but God's speech, God's speaking 10 things, that created the world. Okay, so God spoke the world into existence. Okay, classic. The Zohar in source number 9, famous quote, you've definitely heard it before, even if you haven't seen the Zohar inside. God looked into the Torah and created the world. At least some people read this Zohar as if it's saying the Torah was like a blueprint. God looked at the blueprint and built the world, as if, so God not as speaker, but as architect. Okay, here's a third metaphor. This one's also from Chazal, source number 10, Gemara and Megillah. On the pasuk in Shmuel, Ein sur ke'Eloheinu. There's no rock like our God. The Gemara reads it homiletically as Ein tzayar ke'Eloheinu. There's no artist like our God. If we were giving a talk about art, art and God, we would certainly bring this in. God as artist, and then it compares the divine artist to human artists. Okay, 3 classic metaphors. What does it mean for God to create? God is like a speaker. God is like an architect. God is like an artist. How about God as a singer? God singing the world into existence. To be honest, this does not appear in classic Jewish sources. What? He is the king. That is true. But 2 religious authors, not Jewish religious, but religious authors of the 20th century, wrote into their fantasy works God singing the world into existence. And these 2 are people who didn't happen to teach at Oxford at the same time and place. They were drinking buddies, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And they weren't just drinking buddies, but not telling the whole story now, but C.S. Lewis was a religious Christian, Church of England. J.R.R. Tolkien had grown up Catholic and had rejected it. And C.S. Lewis convinced him to become religious again, even though for him, religious was Catholic, not Anglican, but it didn't matter. And each one later described his writing of his fantasy books as a religious thing, which is more obvious for the Chronicles of Narnia because there are clear Christian metaphors or not, or clear Christian references, less clear for Tolkien, but Tolkien wrote about how he put his religion into the books. There's a lot to say about that. Anyway, what they both put in, each one thought the other one's approach to fantasy was a bad one. But one thing they have in common is they each wrote a scene of God creating the world through music. Source number 11, the magician's nephew, that's the one in which they go back in time till when God creates the universe, and there's also a lamppost there. But in the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. There were no words. It was hardly even a tune, but it was beyond comparison the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. And skipping a little bit, the other person, Diggory and Polly, are just regular kids who happen to be watching it. She was finding the song more and more interesting because she thought she was beginning to see the connection between the music and the things that were happening. When you listened to, well, she says Aslan, but God, when you listened to God's song, you heard the things he was making up. When you looked around you, you saw them. This was so exciting, she had no time to be afraid. So C.S. Lewis imagines God singing the world into existence. And even though it was only published much later, J.R.R. Tolkien did the same thing in a slightly different way in the Silmarillion. That's his posthumous book of the history of Middle-earth. He apparently wrote this, or at least the first draft of it, as far back as the 1920s, but it wasn't actually published until a few years after he died in the 1970s. So you can find the section online. The section about God and what we would call the angels singing the world into existence. Look at the top right of page 2. And it came to pass that Iluvatar, who is God, called together all the Ainur, who is what we would call the Malachim, the angels, and declared to them a mighty theme, etc., etc. Iluvatar said to them, of the theme that I've declared to you, I will now, my ratzon is that ye make in harmony together a great music. And then he describes what we would call the angels singing and with musical instruments. End of the paragraph. And the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. So this is written by someone who is a Christian and well aware of Breshit Perek Aleph and retelling it in a way that's not God speaking, but God singing, or technically having the angels sing. Like I said, there isn't a classic Jewish source that says this. I was first alerted to this by source number 13, a bar mitzvah speech of Ezra Klinghoffer, who's, well, he's in college now. His dad is David Klinghoffer, who's an American Orthodox author and essayist who's very involved in political writing. And they published his bar mitzvah talk online in which he quotes, he doesn't quote Narnia, he quotes Silmarillion, and he says, end of 13, is it going too far to say our God Hashem not only spoke, but using the Torah as his instrument and his song, sang the world into existence? It's not going too far because if you turn the page to the top right of page 3, Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, who was Rosh Hashiva of Merkaz Harav after Rav Kook passed away, in between Rav Avram Yitzchak Kook and Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook, in one of his many Mei Marom books, he more or less says this. He doesn't quote the Silmarillion. Unfortunately, he passed away before the Silmarillion was published, and also before the Narnia book was published. But Rav Charlap more or less says that the Torah, that the world is one big song that God created. Every part of the world is a note in this song. And what's his source? The Zohar, that God looked into the Torah and created the world. Like I said before, we usually understand this as God looked into the Torah as a blueprint. But Rav Charlap seems to view that, to read that Zohar as God read the score, the musical score, and sang the world into existence. Oh, okay, so I guess there is a classic, maybe. According to Rav Charlap, there is a classic source that supports this, and that is the Zohar. By the way, Rav Charlap goes on to say that when the halacha, which we skip, but it's source number 14 in the Rambam, when the halacha says a sefer Torah is pasul, the Torah scroll is invalid if it's missing even one letter. So he says that's because the Torah missing a letter is like a song with a note missing. There's something wrong. And if somebody understands the song well enough, somebody listening to, I don't know, an orchestra rehearsing, the conductor says, wait, the third violin missed a note, because the conductor understands the music well enough to see if there's any tiny little thing wrong, it ruins the whole thing. So Rav Charlap understands that halacha in light of this mashal that he's anticipating Lewis and Tolkien and saying that when we keep the mitzvot, it's like we're playing the song of the world. That's Rav Charlap. Skipping a little bit to page 4. A different way of looking at the Torah as a Shirah, as a shir, as a song, is from the Aruch HaShulchan, who is a younger contemporary of the Netziv, and he says something fascinating in the introduction to the Aruch HaShulchan. Rabbi Michael Epstein, source number 18. I'm just going to paraphrase it. He says, every time there's a machloket, every time there's a debate, whether among rabbis, whether it's the rabbis of the Mishnah or the Gemara or the Gaonim or the Poskim, both sides are the words of the living God. Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim. And both sides reflect some aspect of halacha. And this makes the Torah more glorious, that there are multiple opinions. So far, that's totally standard. And then he goes on to say, the Chol HaTorah, the one that starts with the word v'haTorah, the Chol HaTorah kula nikreit Shirah. The whole Torah is called a song. V'tiferet hashir hi kishahakolot mishunim zemizeh. The glory of a song is expressed when the different voices or sounds are different from each other. V'zeu ikar ha'ni'imut. The beauty of the song is in this harmony of different sounds or different voices. And if Misha Mishotet Biyama Talmud, somebody who swims in the sea of Talmud, Yir'en Ni'imot Mishunot, Mikol HaKolot HaMishunot Zemizeh, the swimmer in the sea of Talmud will appreciate the beauty of all the different sounds. So he's kind of like combining, mixing metaphors, swimming in the Talmud and listening to music, but he's saying it's really the same concept. And Rabbi Sachs, try to imagine Rabbi Sachs saying this, but he actually did write this. I hear him saying this every time I read it. He quotes this, source number 19, he quotes the Aruch HaShulchan, that the Torah is compared to a song because to those who appreciate music, the most beautiful choral sound is a complex harmony with many different voices singing different notes. So too, it's with the Torah and its myriad commentaries, its 70 faces. This is now Rabbi Sachs taking over. Judaism is a choral symphony scored for many voices. The written text is its melody. The oral tradition is its polyphony. Okay. Rabbi Sachs then moves in his own direction. By the way, I just want to point out source number 20, Rav Shmuel Rabinovich, the official Rav of the Kotel and the holy places here in Israel, in his Dvar Torah published in the Jerusalem Post several years ago, quotes this Aruch HaShulchan and then says, and then when you write a Torah for yourself, or by extension, when you add new ideas to the Torah, it's like you are joining that song, continuing this mashal. Rabbi Sachs then takes this idea of the Aruch HaShulchan that the Torah is like many voices singing together, and he takes it in a different direction. In source number 23, it's the same essay by Rabbi Sachs called Torah as Song. Why call the Torah a song? Because if we are to hand on our faith and way of life to the next generation, it must sing. Torah must be affective, fancy word for emotional. Torah must be affective, not just cognitive. It must speak to our emotions. Then he goes on to say, skipping a little bit, if our Torah lacks passion, we will not succeed in passing it on to the future. But he's saying, right, because the Torah is supposed to be a song, and with a song, it's understood that part of what separates singing from words on a page, even great poetry, there's something, an extra dimension to the song. There's an emotion that you're not necessarily going to get from just reading words on the page. Music, he says, music is the affective dimension of communication, the medium through which we express, evoke, and share emotion. Precisely because we are creatures of emotion, music is an essential part of the vocabulary of mankind. And then he goes and applies this to, and he points out that it's not just, this is now something we haven't seen yet, it's not just that the psukim call the Torah a Shirah, but he says if you look at Jewish life, traditional Jewish life, you notice song is central to the Judaic experience. And this is going to fit in with the Torah as Shirah. We do not pray, we daven, meaning we sing the words we direct toward heaven. Nor do we read the Torah, we chant it, each word with its own cantillation. Skipping a little bit, each time and text has its specific melodies. The same prayer may be sung to half a dozen different tunes, depending on whether it's part of the morning, afternoon, or evening service, and whether the day is a weekday, Shabbat, a festival, or one of the high holy days. There are different cantillations, the trop for biblical readings, etc., etc. Music is the map of the Jewish spirit. And each spiritual experience has its own distinctive melodic landscape. I don't know, most of us are in shul and we're like, oh yeah, okay, whatever, that's the tune they're supposed to do today. And Rabbi Sachs, sat in shul and he's, saying like, wow, apparently, what's behind this essay, like, this is one more expression, of the Jewish spirit, the trop that is special, or the nigun that is special for this particular day. Rabbi Sachs goes on to say, even though Judaism is a religion of words, whenever the language of Judaism aspires to the spiritual, it modulates into song, which is what he was saying before with the davening and the Kriyat Torah and the learning as well. If we are to make Torah new in every generation, we have to find ways of singing its song a new way. The words never change, but the music does. And that's one more application of the Torah as a Shirah. If you imagine it as a poem, you could put a poem to different types of music. It's the same poem, but it ends up sounding very different depending on how you on the music and the what's the term? Lachan. Composition. No, when they say who wrote, when they say like on the score, words and I guess music. There's a different word. Okay, okay, fine. Okay, thank you. So the difference between the original author or poet and the composer puts it to music. And Rabbi Sachs is saying it could very well be that the Torah, of course, never changes. But the Torah, of course, does change. What's the difference between what changes and what doesn't change? The words don't change, but the music does. Interesting way of applying this mashal of the Torah as a song. He concludes, the Torah is God's libretto, which fits with what we said before, that God looked into the Torah and sang the world into existence. And we, the Jewish people, are his choir. Collectively, we have sung God's song. We are the performers of his choral symphony. It's funny that when Rabbi Sachs imagines music, he imagines symphonies. Some of us don't think in those terms or don't think of music in those terms, but that's okay. At least when I wrote this up as a Devar Torah, I concluded as follows in source number 24, very meta now, I'm quoting myself. In conclusion, when we refer to the Torah as a Shirah, we mean that it is both poem and song. Its texts are intricate and demand interpretation, like the Netziv said, and at the same time, they are uplifting and inspiring, which is what Rabbi Sachs said. In this way, the Torah lets us teach the world to sing in perfect harmony, which for me has very different connotations from the symphony. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Does anybody want to add or argue to the Torah as a poem or in what way is the Torah like a poem? In what way is the Torah like a song? Eruv ve'eruv. Fair enough. I feel like this is just like the beginning because there are so many other possibilities. Like there's a lot you could say about music and there's a lot you could say about poetry. And these are the main sources that I found addressing the issue. Like I said, almost all of them are contemporary. The Netziv and the Aruch HaShulchan were the first ones, as far as I know, to even talk about this. But it would not surprise me if, even as we speak, somebody has come up with, with other interpretations. Keep a lookout for them next time we get to Parshat Vayelech. Right. The Ramban says that, right? So that's more like as a poem, different interpretations of the poem. Oh, okay. Right. And that sometimes the poet breaks the line in a place that's different from what you might have expected. Okay. Right. That's Tikkunei Zohar, right? A book in the Zoharic literature with 70 chapters, each one presenting a different interpretation of the word Bereshit. So, once you have all you need is one book like that. And that kind of, tells you maybe every word or almost every word in the Torah could have a book like that, depending on where you put the stops.
Same exact words, you just stop and switch it over to consider.
Right, the combination of starting at a different point and the different tune. Right. Also, it's very dramatic when the Shliach Tzibur starts singing while he's in his in his regular spot and not in the front of the shul, and everybody's like, "Wait, where is that coming from?" Very dramatic, adding to it. You said before about the musical,
So, tradition story. So you have a story that's planted poetry and song. That's there.
Okay. Well, okay, there you go. So how does that go? If somebody learns Torah, if somebody reads the Torah without singing, they've done something wrong. So yeah. Right. They've cheapened it. So yes, that fits very well with what Rabbi Sachs was saying. Where maybe Rabbi Sachs is explaining that concept. Why? Why do you have to sing it? Because it needs to be. The Torah needs to be accompanied with by passion, by emotion. Right, and it's. I just want to read a quick thing on this from a book of a very unusual book by one of my teachers, Rabbi David Ebner. When I was at Yeshivat HaMivtar, he was the Mashgiach Ruchani there, and after Yeshivat HaMivtar closed, he became the Mashgiach Ruchani of Yeshivat Eretz HaTzvi, and is still there now. And he has published 2 little books of poems. The second one's called Perhaps This Poem, but the first one is the one I'm quoting now, The Library of Everything, Poems and Torah Commentaries. You don't usually see those together. And in his introduction, he says something that fits with what we were just saying about with what Rabbi Sachs said with the passion. Just a couple of paragraphs. Torah and Tehillim, philosophy and prayer are all constructed as poetry and should produce Jews whose sense of language, its magic and wonder is incredibly refined. Indeed, at times this has been true in Jewish history. However, since the language and sensitivity that are the heart and bones of poetry are no simple matter, they produce Jews whose actual involvement in the texts of their lives is not the Torah of poetry that is supposed to be in their mouths, but rather the Torah of rote recitation that is only on their lips. And then he goes on, then he does a little bit more complaining, or worse, this may produce Jews who have essentially given up, mumbling prayers they don't understand, whose hearts are never struck by wonder and awe by and from dawn to dusk, and who would trade the words of the prophets for a Kiddush club. Is it any wonder that Psukei de Zimra is the time during which tefillin is donned, that coming to shul on Shabbat on time means arrival at Baruch Hu? I guess he's bothered by this. Is it any wonder, and then he concludes this point, is it any wonder that Midrash, which is so rooted in the poetry of Torah and the precision of language it entails, Midrash is so little understood, is routinely skipped in Gemara classes, and is relegated to children's, quote, kosher fairy tale reading. The difference being that our fairy tales are true. So this clearly bothers him, and it's interesting that he ties in lack of passion in observant Jewish communities, lack of passion ties that in with the lack of appreciation of poetry. So that ties a few things together. Thanks for joining me. And I want to, again, thank the Sevrinskys for having the shiur. And I guess everybody should come and eat.
So